A soldier is on duty at a permanent vehicle checkpoint in Fermanagh. Two men arrive in a civilian car. They don't stop, check in and move on. They come inside. They make a brew for themselves and for the lads on the gate. They have a chat. Specifically, they ask which players have been through recently. Players, Operation Banner, slang for known IRA and paramilitary figures whose movements the security forces tracked. The two men show him what's in the car, equipment not described in detail. Then they leave. He says they were a decent bunch. He says it never appealed to him. That account was left in a YouTube comment section under a video about 14 Intelligence Company by someone who was there. 7 people like that left accounts under that video. Their comments appear in no book, no parliamentary record, no official history. They just recognized something and added to it decades after the fact. What they describe collectively is what the unit looked like to the uniformed British Army standing next to it in South Armagh and Fermanagh from 1976 onward. Almost everything written about 14 Intelligence Company is written from the inside, by men with something to protect, or from the outside, by people guessing. This is neither. This is the army that was 3 feet away, at the checkpoint, on the patrol, in the barracks. Close enough to see, not cleared to know. The unit is always described through its operations. Described instead through the ordinary soldiers who worked alongside it, it becomes a different and more credible organization. Competent, socially peculiar, and, according to some of those soldiers, resented within regular units for what it didn't pass down. To understand where the unit worked, you need to understand Bessbrook. The village sits a few miles northwest of Newry in County Armagh. In the 1840s, a Quaker industrialist named John Grubb Richardson built a linen mill there in granite, construction running from around 1845 through the 1880s, the complex growing in stages to employ thousands of workers at its peak. Richardson built a model village around it on temperance principles. No public houses, no pawn shops, no police station. A Victorian experiment in what industrial community could look like that attracted social reformers from across Britain and Ireland. The Besbrook Spinning Company ran tens of thousands of spindles. Its products included fine shirtings, damasks, sheetings and drills. By 1970, the mill was all but finished as a business. BBC Northern Ireland's coverage of the base puts the Army's requisition at around 1970 to 71. Linen production was winding down. The Army needed a substantial base in South Armagh, and this Victorian industrial complex, already built to house a large workforce, was available. Royal Engineers undertook conversion works from 1972 onward. The mill's 2 chimneys came down. High steel perimeter walls went up. The mill worker housing was converted to officer accommodation. One former Royal Navy photographer, recalling the site in the 1970s, described the operations room as a garden shed beside the mill entrance. The physical transformation took years to complete. Ulster weavers continued to operate on part of the site until linen production finally ceased in 1987, meaning for a period the base and the mill coexisted, soldiers and weavers sharing the same granite structures that Richardson had built for an entirely different experiment in human organisation. South Armagh in 1976 was what Secretary of State for Northern Ireland Merlin Rees had labelled bandit country. The designation captures something real, but it also flattens it. The IRA's South Armagh Brigade hadn't simply made the area dangerous in a generalised sense. It had made specific forms of military activity operationally impossible. The roads were the problem. Culvert bombs, command wire devices, and pressure plate landmines had turned vehicle movement south and west of Bessbrook into a serious calculation rather than routine logistics. A resupply run to Crossmaglen, approximately a short helicopter flight to the south, couldn't be made by road with any confidence that the vehicle would complete the journey. Foot patrols outside the immediate area were conducted with the same kind of preparation that in other theatres would precede a deliberate attack. Toby Harnden's Bandit Country describes the army presence in South Armagh as centred on Besbrook Mill, the hub from which almost all activity radiated. The logic that followed from the road situation was straightforward and mechanical. If you can't resupply by road, you resupply by air. If you can't move troops by road, you move them by air. If every emergency extraction has to go by air because the alternative is driving into a mine, you need a helipad large enough and busy enough to handle constant throughput. Bessbrook's helipad was the consequence of a battle space in which the ground wasn't safe. RTE, reporting on the base's final closure in June 2007, said Bessbrook was said to be the busiest heliport in Western Europe at the height of the Troubles. That phrasing is deliberate and accurate. No official Ministry of Defence statistics have been located that prove the comparative claim absolutely. What has been located, a Queen's University Belfast land use report and multiple secondary sources citing an average of 600 helicopter movements per week. A former helicopter pilot, writing professionally about his service there, put the tempo at a landing or takeoff on average every 9 minutes, around the clock. The nickname that emerged among soldiers, Bessbrook International, wasn't ironic. A 2008 Hansard debate on RAF Aldergrove's role included a parliamentary reference to Bessbrook as the busiest heliport in Europe, the closest the claim gets to official parliamentary acknowledgement, though the surrounding passage in the record is truncated. The scale matters for what the unit was doing there. A base handling 600 helicopter movements a week isn't a quiet outpost. It's a heavily trafficked hub, with constant arrivals and departures, multiple units rotating through, and a social environment in which men with cover identities could move with a degree of anonymity that a smaller installation wouldn't provide. The granite walls of Richardson's Mill, designed to contain a workforce, now contained something considerably more complicated. January 1976 shifted the public picture of what was operating out of Bessbrook. The King's Mill massacre, 10 Protestant textile workers shot near the village by the South Armagh Republican Action Force, prompted Harold Wilson's government to announce the deployment of an SAS troop to South Armagh, publicly acknowledged and quartered at Besbrook Mill. The base moved from logistics hub to a publicly named fixture of the covert war. What wasn't named publicly was what else was there. The organisation that became 14 Intelligence Company didn't begin cleanly. The Military Reaction Force, the MRF, was the first attempt to solve the problem. Formed in the summer of 1971 under 39 Infantry Brigade, built by Brigadier Frank Kitson out of techniques he'd developed fighting the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya, the MRF put soldiers in civilian clothes into Republican communities to collect intelligence, handle informers, and conduct what its own former members later described as targeted shootings. Up to 40 men, hand-picked across the British Army, operating in plain clothes and unmarked civilian cars with pistols and Sterling submachine guns. The MRF also ran front companies, the Four Square Laundry, a mobile service operating in nationalist West Belfast, with surveillance equipment hidden in the roof compartment of the van and clothes forensically checked for explosives residue before being returned to the customer. A massage parlour on Antrim Road, an office at College Square. The covert infrastructure was genuinely inventive. The operational discipline wasn't. A Ministry of Defence review found the MRF had no provision for detailed command and control. Former members admitted to the BBC's Panorama programme in 2013 that the unit shot unarmed people without warning. One said flatly that they had not been there to act like an army unit, they had been there to act like a terror group. By September 1972, the IRA had compromised 2 MRF agents, interrogated them, and learned the structure of the operations. The IRA attacked MRF front companies, and the unit was wound down as a result. The replacement was the Special Reconnaissance Unit, the SRU, brought under direct control of HQ Northern Ireland in 1972. A top-secret briefing prepared for Prime Minister Harold Wilson ahead of a meeting with the Irish Taoiseach in April 1974 gives the precise status at that point. The SRU had replaced MRF units created in 1971 and was operating with about 130 all ranks under direct command of HQ Northern Ireland. The briefing specifies the cover. The unit operated under the cover name Northern Ireland Training and Advisory Teams, Northern Ireland, NITAT, NI, ostensibly the equivalent of genuine NITAT teams in UK land forces and BAOR. A second layer of institutional disguise, hiding inside the name of a real training organisation. The distinction between the MRF and what followed it matters. The MRF was improvised, undisciplined, and built on a logic that treated violence as part of the surveillance function. The professionalism that the MRF lacked was deliberately engineered into the replacement. By 1973, 3 operational detachments had been established across the brigade areas of Northern Ireland. The detachment operating in the 3 brigade area of South Armagh worked from Castle Dillon, County Armagh, a location Toby Harnden places some 2 miles southeast of Crossmaglen. The cover designation for that 3 brigade detachment appears in a parliamentary written answer given by Defence Minister Roger Freeman to MP Ken Livingstone in March 1988. 4 Field Survey Troop, Royal Engineers. The unit's declared function was aerial photography, ground surveys and mapping, a plausible Royal Engineers role, difficult to verify or disprove from outside the wire. Mark Urban's 1992 book Big Boys Rules identifies 4 Field Survey Troop as a cover name for the 3 Brigade detachment of the unit during 1974. The Pat Finucane Centre's Counter-Gangs report describes it as declared to be part of the Royal Engineers and based at Castle Dillon, County Armagh. At least one individual's service record, accessible through a LinkedIn profile, lists 4 FD Survey TP, NIJSOP, INT Photography, as a Royal Engineers posting in Northern Ireland, meaning the designation appeared in official personnel paperwork as a genuine unit. It does not appear on the official list of Royal Engineers survey units in Ulster for the relevant period. What that absence meant in practice for a regular soldier sharing a base or an area with this unit is worth thinking about. Royal Engineers survey troops have an obvious and visible job. They survey things. They produce maps, they take measurements, they move around terrain with equipment that has an identifiable purpose. Men wearing that designation who never seemed to be doing any survey work, who came and went in civilian vehicles, who spoke when they needed to and otherwise didn't. That gap between the paperwork identity and the observable behaviour was the thing that registered. Not as threat or suspicion necessarily, as strangeness. The operational cover worked against external enemies. Inside the wire, it produced a specific social texture that the uniformed army noticed without being able to name. The connection to Bessbrook specifically runs through Captain Robert Nayrac of the Grenadier Guards. Nayrak's official role, documented in publicly available sources, was liaison officer between Besbrook military base and covert organizations, including the SAS and RUC Special Branch, the person who connected the Castle Dillon detachment to its operational hub. He served multiple tours in Northern Ireland from the early 1970s onward. He left Besbrook Mill on the night of the 14th of May 1977 for an undercover operation at the Three Steps Inn in Drominty. The IRA abducted him, took him across the border and killed him. His body was never recovered. The George Cross citation awarded posthumously does not name 14 Intelligence Company, which was itself a reflection of the unit's cover status at the time. The name 14 Intelligence and Security Company came into formal use in the early 1980s, shortened in Army speech to 14 Intelligence Company, 14 INT, or simply the Det. For most of those years, the unit had no name a regular soldier would have recognized. It was men in civilian clothes, with a paperwork identity pointing to a Royal Engineers survey unit that didn't do survey work. It recruited from all three armed services: Army, Royal Navy, Royal Marines. Women were eligible from the outset, the first time in British military history that a Special Forces adjacent organisation had admitted women to full operational roles. The logic wasn't progressive gesture. A woman in a car with a male operator looked like a couple. A man sitting alone in a parked car drew attention. Concealment was the mission. Everything that aided concealment was an asset. For a regular soldier, the first encounter with the recruiting pipeline had a specific character. The advert appeared on unit notice boards. Documented in open sources, including a reconstruction published by SOFREP, it reads, "From time to time, there is a requirement for men and women to volunteer to undertake special duties of a hazardous nature in Northern Ireland. The selection and training for special duties are both rigorous and arduous." The advert directed interested volunteers to Defence Council instructions, the standard Ministry of Defence administrative documents used to communicate policy, personnel guidance and procedure across the services. DCIs were the formal administrative backbone of British military life. Training directives, posting procedures, pay guidance, all routed through them. For the DET's purposes, they served as the next step beyond the notice board for anyone who wanted operational detail without asking questions they weren't supposed to ask. Those who expressed interest were then visited. Multiple accounts describe what one detailed reconstruction characterizes as a mysterious bunch in civvies turning up at the parent unit, a mobile assessment team, arriving in plain clothes, running physical training, IQ tests, and interviews on site. Not at a training establishment, at the parent unit, in civilian clothes. The recruiting process was itself a version of what the job looked like. The first contact with 14 INT's system was plainclothes men appearing in a military environment, doing something that didn't fit the uniform context, and disappearing again. Selection drew on SAS practice. The initial directing staff on early courses came from 22 SAS. Candidates faced loaded marches, memory retention tests under exhaustion, navigation exercises, sleep deprivation, erratic scheduling, milling, full contact boxing, and intellectual tasks completed immediately after physical exertion. Standard sensory deprivation techniques included not telling candidates what time it was. One documented selection course produced 17 deployable operators from approximately 1,000 applicants. Candidates with visible tattoos, prominent scars, or unusual birthmarks were routinely rejected. Looking unmilitary in civilian clothes was an advantage, not a deficiency. James Rennie, writing under that pseudonym in a 1996 memoir cleared by the Ministry of Defence and catalogued by the Imperial War Museum, described the process as the most physically, intellectually and emotionally demanding anywhere in the world. The memoir's value as objective history is limited. It's an insider account, written from inside the thing, by someone with every reason to frame it a certain way. But it confirms the basic contours of what the process looked like, and carries the institutional imprimatur of MOD clearance. One commenter on the Historical Notes 14 Intelligence Company video, posting under the username @MGTauSoldier8673, describes the selection process in specific terms that include a beat-up day at the Commando Training Centre at Lympstone, the Royal Marines facility in Devon. No published memoir, secondary source, or open-source analytical account has been located that independently confirms Lympstone as a DTET selection venue. That detail rests on this one account. The Grey Dynamics analysis of the unit notes that directing staff included Royal Marines personnel, and Rennie's memoir confirms multi-service DS involvement. So Lympstone is plausible in a general sense, but it can't be stated as established record on the basis of a single commenter. It's presented here as exactly that, one account from one person who says he went through it, under a username that is a marker of someone willing to be specific. What is confirmed is that the pipeline was visible enough that regular soldiers across the British Army encountered it, at least at the notice board level. The advert appeared. Teams visited units. People were approached or volunteered, and some came back different, or didn't come back to their parent unit in any meaningful sense at all. The man who left with a selection letter and returned 18 months later, changed in ways he couldn't describe, was a recognisable figure in the British Army of the 1970s and 1980s. Recognisable because everyone knew at least one. Now to the encounters themselves. The checkpoint brew is the most complete account and the simplest. A uniformed soldier on a PVCP, a permanent vehicle checkpoint, in Fermanagh. Two men in a civilian car. They came inside, made brews for themselves and for the duty soldiers, asked which players had been through recently, showed what was in the car, and left. The commenter says they were a decent bunch. He says it never appealed to him. Two men drank tea with soldiers at a checkpoint, asked operationally useful questions, demonstrated their equipment. The show and tell was standard procedure for any covert operator passing through a uniformed position to avoid a blue-on-blue, and drove away into ground the checkpoint soldiers weren't cleared to enter. The soldier understood what he was looking at. He just didn't join. Ivor Longshot's account is specific to Derryard, a PVCP in South Fermanagh, in Derryard Townland, a few miles north of Rosslea, approximately 2 kilometres from the Fermanagh-Monaghan border. Fermanagh was different territory from South Armagh. The border was more porous, the landscape more dispersed, the IRA threat present, but structured differently than in the contained killing ground around Crossmaglen. Permanent vehicle checkpoints along the Fermanagh border were a different kind of posting. Less the helicopter hub intensity of Bessbrook, more the grinding routine of a static position on a minor road, manned around the clock, watching for movement across a frontier that had been politically invisible before the Troubles made it operationally significant. The Royal Hampshire Regiment's regimental records confirm that Derryard, PVCP, was in operation by at least 1982, when Y Company manned it alongside similar checkpoints at Anna Martin. The checkpoint ran until 13th of December 1989, when a provisional IRA active service unit mounted a major frontal assault. An armoured truck, two 12.7mm DSHK heavy machine guns, RPG-7s, grenades, and a flamethrower. Lance Corporal Michael Patterson, 21, and Private James Houston, 22, were killed. The checkpoint was rebuilt after the attack and operated until March 1991, when it was dismantled as part of border security rearrangements codenamed Operation Mutilate. Any encounter, at Ivor Longshot, describes at Derryard, therefore, falls within the period when the checkpoint was functional, from 1982 at the latest to one side or the other of December 1989. The commenter's use of PVCP, Permanent Vehicle Checkpoint, the correct operational abbreviation, is worth noting. That's the period terminology. Published oral histories of the Operation Banner period, including A Long, Long War and Northern Ireland, An Agony Continued, use the same abbreviation throughout when describing checkpoint duty. Most people describing British Army checkpoints in Northern Ireland in casual conversation use a generic word. Using PVCP correctly, unprompted, in a YouTube comment is the kind of small marker that indicates someone who was actually there. A third account describes a former colleague encountered in civilian life after service. The colleague claimed to have served in a covert unit. The claim wasn't believed. Not an unreasonable response. People embellish service records, claim things they didn't do, and the unit had no publicly acknowledged name that could be cross-referenced. What resolved the skepticism was a photograph album. The former colleague produced photographs that implied operational activity, surveillance work, the visual texture of what the det actually produced. The story was believed after the album. That detail describes something specific about the unit's culture and about what life after it looked like. Former operators didn't generally boast about the work. The selection culture was built on discretion, the operational requirements reinforced it, and the Official Secrets Act formalized it. They returned to civilian life carrying knowledge that couldn't be easily shared and that no one around them could verify. The only people who understood were others who had done the same job, and those people also didn't talk. A photograph album, produced in a domestic setting to a disbelieving former colleague, was what passed for evidence. The secrecy that surrounded the posting didn't stop when the posting ended. It just became a particular kind of social condition, the private knowledge of a job that officially didn't exist, shared with nobody except, eventually, a skeptical friend who needed proof. The circumstance that produced the album is also the circumstance that produced the YouTube comment. Decades later, having seen something on the internet that recognized the thing he'd served alongside, the soldier typed it out. The album was for the friend who didn't believe him. The comment was for the same reason. Not testimony to a historian, not an official record, but a form of saying, "This was real. This happened. I was there." The third encounter type is the recognized face. The same Fermanagh checkpoint soldier, or someone in nearly identical circumstances, saw a man on a later tour. A man from a previous posting, or a previous unit, or simply from earlier in a career. Saw him in a context that made the situation obvious, and understood from that context what the man had become. Being, as the commenter puts it, all mysterious. 3 words, and they are exactly right. Not conducting undercover surveillance. Not on a covert operation. Being all mysterious, the precise, slightly deadpan language of someone who understands what they're seeing but refuses to give it more weight than it deserves. The deflation is the point. The man was being mysterious because that was now his job, and the soldier watching knew it, and the knowledge sat between them without being acknowledged, and the tour continued. The highest engagement comment in the entire thread, carrying 32 likes and 13 replies, comes from Ian Henderson 6256. The exact content of that comment would require direct access to the video to reproduce accurately. What the engagement data establishes is that whatever it said landed as something true to a significant portion of the audience. On a channel with under 20,000 subscribers at the time of filming, 32 likes and 13 replies represents a specific kind of recognition. The figure is high enough that multiple veterans engaged actively, arguing, confirming, or expanding. The 13 replies in particular indicate a thread, not just agreement, but conversation. That doesn't happen under comments that describe something peripheral or unrecognized. It happens under comments that describe something many people in the audience experienced and either hadn't heard articulated or hadn't expected to hear articulated on YouTube. The difference between that comment and the 3-like complaint, which is the next one discussed, isn't simply volume. It's the difference between something that resonated with a community and something that expressed one person's view. One comment contains a harder claim. Posted by MGTOW Soldier 8673, carrying 3 likes. The claim: the unit had a poor reputation in regular units during Operation Banner for dropping people in it by not passing intelligence down. Dropping people in, its British Army vernacular for placing colleagues in danger or difficulty. In this context, it appears to mean detectivity that triggered IRA attention or provoked a response, without warning the regular units who would absorb the consequences. A surveillance operation in a particular village. An undercover presence on a particular route. Activity that the IRA noticed and responded to, while the battalion on the ground had no idea what had been running. That is a serious allegation. It's one soldier's view with the lowest community validation of any comment in the thread. It does not carry the weight of Ian Henderson's 6256's 32-like engagement. It's presented here clearly as what it is. One account from one person, which deserves neither dismissal nor elevation beyond what the evidence supports. The counter case is structural rather than defensive. The military intelligence architecture in Northern Ireland involved nearly 20 units formed or evolved from one another between 1969 and 1983, by Mark Urban's count. Most of them operated on strict need-to-know principles. Army intelligence cells classified material for UK eyes only, which denied the RUC access to it. RUC Special Branch ran its own sources and protected them from Army collection. MI5 operated its own stream. The result was a system in which no single unit at the operational level had a complete picture, and in which sharing downward, to the patrol, the checkpoint, the battalion, carried the risk of compromising the very sources that made the intelligence worth having. The logic of that system meant that a regular unit on patrol was downstream of everything, not just of 14 INT, but of RUC Special Branch, MI5, and Army Intelligence Collection Cells. The compartmentalization that one soldier experienced as the detet dropping people in it was a feature of the entire architecture. Whether specific detet activity ever placed regular units in harm's way without warning, and whether that represented negligence or necessity or both, can't be answered from a 3-like comment. What can be said is that the frustration it describes was real, was documented at the structural level by serious academic and official analysis, and points at a genuine friction that ran through the entire counterinsurgency effort in Northern Ireland for decades. One man's view, the most cautious reading the evidence supports. The name 14 Intelligence Company had a finite lifespan. The organisation it described had begun as the Special Reconnaissance Unit in 1972, cycled through cover designations including NITAT, NI, and the Intelligence and Security Group, acquired the 14 Intelligence and Security Company label in the early 1980s, and was routinely shortened to 14 INT, or the det in common speech. Each renaming was a compromise between operational security and the growing impossibility of pretending the unit didn't exist. 30 years of names, each one slightly more legible than the last, tracing a slow institutional emergence from total denial toward grudging acknowledgement. The unit was also changing in how it connected to the rest of the Special Forces world. From the late 1980s onward, small numbers of SAS and SBS operators rotated into the det on 2-year postings, including a training element. The boundaries that had separated 14 INT from the SAS in its early years, boundaries that included a rule requiring any SAS soldier who wanted to transfer to serve 2 years back at his parent unit first, gradually became more permeable. The det was moving toward formal integration with UK Special Forces rather than existing alongside it. On the 16th of December 2004, the Secretary of State for Defence announced the intention to create a Special Reconnaissance Regiment. On the 5th of April 2005, Defence Secretary Jeff Hoon confirmed the timing. The entry in Hansard is brief. The Special Reconnaissance Regiment, SRR, will stand up on the 6th of April 2005. A written ministerial statement in April 2006 confirmed the unit had become operational. The SRR was formed around a core of personnel and capabilities from 14 Intelligence Company and the SRU, inheriting the covert surveillance role and the methods, and incorporated formally into the United Kingdom's Special Forces Directorate alongside the SAS and SBS. The Special Reconnaissance Regiment still exists. What changed with the move into UK Special Forces beyond the name was status. The SRR is acknowledged. It has a cap badge and a formal place in the order of battle. Former members of 14 INT operated in a space where the unit's very existence was contested for most of its operational life. Former operators of the SRR operate in a space where the unit's existence is public information and their service is formally recognised. The men who did the job in the 1970s and 1980s don't, for the most part, write memoirs. A small number have, under pseudonyms, with MOD clearance. James Rennie's The Operators is the most widely cited. All were cleared before publication. All are insider accounts, written from inside the thing, shaped by what the authors could and couldn't say, and by their own relationship to the job they did and the institution they served. The 7 people who left accounts under that YouTube video weren't operators. They were the army that stood alongside them. Checkpoint soldiers, patrol veterans, people who saw the civilian car pull up and understood, roughly, what was happening without ever being told. That is a different archive than the memoirs. It's less complete, less operationally detailed, more subject to the distortions of memory and the indirection of a comment box. But it is also, in one specific sense, more honest. It's what the unit looked like to people who had no incentive to make it seem more impressive than it was, and no reason to protect its reputation, and no interest in mythology. They describe the brew and the photo album and the man being all mysterious, because those were the things that actually happened to them, stripped of everything the insiders had reason to emphasize. The academic literature on Operation Banner notes that the military experience narrated from the perspective of ordinary soldiers remains underrepresented as an archive. A JSTOR article on composing personal histories of the campaign makes the point explicitly. YouTube comment sections aren't what the Academy has in mind. But they are where that kind of testimony turns up, decades late, under videos about units the commenters served alongside, written by people who aren't trying to establish anything beyond the fact that they were there. Return to the checkpoint in Fermanagh. The soldier who never joined watched two men in civilian clothes drink tea in his sangar, show him what was in their car, ask which players had come through that week, and drive off into ground he wasn't cleared to enter. He knew a couple of lads who probably went on to the unit. One of them he is certain about. He saw him again on a later tour, being all mysterious. That is the whole of most people's contact with 14 Intelligence Company. A conversation. And then a car pulling away. The unit was renamed, reorganized, absorbed, and rebuilt. The organization that came out the other end still exists under a different name. The men who did the job don't write memoirs. What survives is second-hand, told by the soldiers standing next to them in comment sections decades late. It isn't much, but it is the only version anyone outside ever gets. If you want more stories like this one, subscribe.